include any benefits to the teacher, classroom, student, or person. Observation 3, we hold quantitative evidence or data to the highest standard in today's round. With this in mind, examine contention 1. Standardized testing causes reform. There are two ways in which this occurs. Subpoint A, international testing. A report published by the U.S. Department of Education explains how deeply troubling achievement gaps in America are painfully evident on the PISA assessment, an international standardized test. And the U.S. Agency of International Affairs furthers that policymakers are increasingly looking to assessment results to measure system performance. Recently, efforts have been made to identify how data from assessment contributed to system reforms that contributed to improved learning over time. Subpoint B, domestic testing. Don W. Hooper of the AASA explains that superintendents are using data to make smarter decisions and they're getting results. Facts and figures tell a more complete story and help critics understand the root causes of the challenges schools face. Data provides us the substance for meaningful ongoing dialogue within the educational community. And Robert Bobb of the Washington Post furthers that abolishing the tests or sabotaging the validity of the results only makes it harder to identify and fix the deep-seated problems in our schools. This is harmful because, as Herbert J. Walberg concludes, research and experience show that standardized tests are good at measuring students' knowledge because they are objective and comprehensive. Remember that reform itself is the biggest impact in the round because it is the only way to improve. But next, look to our contention 2. Standardized testing is closing the achievement gap. Libby Nelson of Vox notes, standardized tests are the only available, consistent, and objective source of data about disparities in educational outcomes, to advocate for greater resource equity in schools and more fair treatment for disadvantaged students. They also concluded, we cannot fix what we cannot measure. Furthermore, Davis M. Denny of the University of Texas notes, high-stakes tests have helped focus public attention on schools with low-achieving students, and suggests that the implementation of high-stakes testing has been a catalyst for increased attention to students with special needs. This is essential because Sean Kavanaugh, using data from the Center of Educational Policy, explains how student achievement in mathematics and reading has risen on state tests, and the gap between white and minority children has narrowed since the passage of the federal No Child Left Behind Act. Comprehensive data shows us that standardized testing helps minority students, which is enough to justify an affirmative ballot. But next, look to contention 3. Policies linked to standardized testing increase student funding. Brian Jacobs of the Brookings Institute finds that NCLB increased average school district expenditure by nearly $600 per pupil. NCLB also led to distinct improvements in a teacher-reported index of student behaviors. And Nikhil Jha of the University of Melbourne quantifies this in a meta-analysis of the entire U.S. school resources literature that across all studies, an increase of $500 in per pupil spending is linked to substantially higher student achievement. In other words, not only does standardized testing benefit minorities, it also increases student expenditure, which in turn increases student achievement. 3 benefits to education. Lastly, examine contention 4. Standardized testing rejuvenates school efficacy. Laura Lee Kearns of St. Francis Xavier University notes, data collection can be used to identify youth, and the gap in their performance can be closed by providing extra support. The discourse of standardized testing to monitor student achievement, raise standards, and increase accountability also stipulates that these measures be used to redress inequalities in students' opportunities to learn. And Sherry Golan of UCLA continues, testing makes schools more accountable for student learning. Testing can promote fast and broad changes within schools and can stimulate major educational reform. This is why Richard P. Phelps concludes in a meta-analysis of 100 years of research that 93% of qualitative studies of standardized testing reported positive effects. It is for these reasons that we are very proud to affirm.
Do you mind if I call for one piece of evidence? Under your contention 2, where you talk about the Kavanaugh card?
Sorry, what?
The Kavanaugh card.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Where's the cut card?
What's the cut card? That is the cut card.
Oh.
Alright, so is everyone ready?
Communicate, resolve, on balance, standardized testing is beneficial to K-12 education in the U.S. We observe that the United Nations writes that all students are entitled to equal educational opportunities regardless of race or social standing. If standardized testing violates this very basic principle of equality in education, then we urge a negation ballot. Contention 1 is educational harms. Standardized testing hurts education in 2 distinct ways. The first is narrowing curriculum. Roger Wagner of Harvard writes that standardized testing molds classrooms to focus on the decontextualized content necessary to pass examinations, since tests only require students to recall fragmented bits of information that don't require them to actually apply their learning. The Center for Education Policy quantifies this and finds that since 2001, standardized tests have forced classrooms to implement a 32% reduction on instructional time that would otherwise be spent on science, social studies, arts, and physical education. The second harm is on current events. John Patterson of Carnegie reports that 80% of teachers cite standardized testing as the reason why they incorporate lesson use into the classroom. He concludes that without a discussion of current events, students aren't able to effectively engage in conversations about civic knowledge or public affairs, and are therefore left with weaker communication abilities and critical thinking skills. Because of this, the NGA concludes in 2008 that 66% of teachers report that their students lack the ability to think critically because of the increased emphasis on standardized testing. The impact is a decrease in graduation. Because standardized tests deprive students of a quality education, Michael D. of Stanford University writes that standardized testing is associated with an 11% increase in the number of high school dropouts. Contention 2 is inequality. Standardized tests perpetuate inequality in two distinct ways. Subpoint A is minority discrimination. The UNHCR reports that minorities statistically have lower standardized test scores than whites because of inherent implicit biases that exist within the development and the administration of standardized tests and the interpretation of their scores. For example, Jay Rosner of the Princeton Review writes in 2009 that he conducts a meta-analysis of over 200,000 standardized tests and finds that if blacks or Hispanics score higher than whites on a certain test question, that question will be thrown out and disregarded from final scores. This bias works to keep minority test scores lower than those of whites. However, these test scores are used to classify students into proficiency levels, and when minorities score lower on standardized tests that are biased against them, they tend to be put into lower level, slower paced courses. In fact, Monty Neal of Emory University quantifies this and concludes that across the nation, African Americans are 3 times as likely as whites to be put into remedial programs, trapping them in a cycle where they fall further and further behind their white counterparts. Because standardized tests put more minorities into remedial programs, James Rooks of Times Magazine concludes in 2012 that standardized tests have widened the achievement gap between whites and minorities by 100% since their implementation. Subpoint B is income discrimination. Stephen Hirsch of the New York Times writes that a majority of content that appears on a standardized test is based on a student's pre-existing knowledge on the subject matter. However, low-income students aren't given the means to build a strong background on materials assessed on a standardized exam because of their restricted financial situation. This leads Hirsch to conclude that low-income students aren't given an equal opportunity on standardized tests because they don't have access to the very materials that they're being tested on. The Casey Foundation quantifies this in 2012 and finds that standardized tests have widened the achievement gap between the rich and the poor by 60% since the 1960s to 2012. Overall, standardized testing violates the principle of equal opportunity because it tailors to the privileged while ignoring minorities and the disadvantaged. That's why Celia Baker of Deseret News concludes in 2012 that standardized tests that are meant to erode class barriers actually appear to be fortifying them. Thus, we negate. Ready for a crossword?
Mm-hmm.
Is everybody? Yeah. Okay. If everybody's ready.
You can have the first question.
Okay. So like on inequality and like discrimination, right? Like it's discrimination because of a bias in administration. Like,
Yeah, and
specifically what I'm getting to is like what is like an African American like high performing question? Like
oh, okay, yeah. So I think you misunderstand the card, right? So what it does is it analyzes 200,000 standardized tests, right? And let's say there's a certain question in that test where African Americans and Hispanics have higher correct answer rates than whites, right? So that means like let's say like 75% of the people that got it correct were like minorities, the other 25 were whites, right? When that happens, that test question is seen as an anomaly and it's thrown out, which disproportionately harms minority groups.
but like it's by pure chance, isn't it? Like there isn't like statistically
no,
African Americans.
Like that's totally what I'm talking about, right? When minorities perform better than whites, people see that as an anomaly, and because of that, those questions are thrown out. That's a flaw with the standardized testing
But it's
system.
by chance though. Like it doesn't necessarily hurt their performance because African Americans and Latinos don't have like higher performance in certain areas.
Wait.
Like,
No,
certain
it's not by
questions, like-
it's not by chance. Like in any single question, if minorities have higher correct answer rates than whites, that question is thrown out. There's no chance at all. Can I have a question?
Like I don't understand like how
Alright, then-
statistically they do better on it. Like wouldn't it be equal? Like
Well,
there
it's
isn't like
just not. If you want to look at the card, you can look at it. Can I have a question?
Sure. You
Cool.
can.
So let's look at your alright, so let's look at your first argument where you talk about reform, right? And you talk about the PISA specifically,
Mhm.
right? So which country is ranked higher on the PISA? The U.S. or which country is like ranked one of the highest in the PISA?
I don't know.
I was like, it's Finland, right? And Finland doesn't have like, Finland only takes three standardized tests the entire year, while like the U.S. is 139. So doesn't that show you that like less standardized test scores, like less standardized testing during the entire year, actually contributes to higher scores on the PISA?
No, that doesn't make sense. Like, why would the number of assessments that they take determine like how
Yeah,
well they
okay,
do?
that's a good question,
Like-
because what we talk about in our case is narrowing curriculum, right?
Yeah.
Because the American education system puts such like a huge emphasis on standardized testing, we see a 32% decrease in subjects like physical education, music, science, history, all of that contributes to like a lowering of like the total amount of knowledge that a student learns in like an education.
Okay, but like, how much do you need to cut back from those programs before it like becomes like significant enough like to generate a harm?
What?
Like, you say it's
Oh,
cut
yeah,
back by
it's-
like 32%.
yeah.
Like, what's like the brink?
Well, like, we're
at
already
what
seeing,
point does
yeah,
this
so
come?
like the brink probably has already been passed, because 66% of teachers report that standardized testing has shown a decrease in the total amount of critical thinking levels in their like children. You want to question?
Yeah, sure. You talk about current events, right? Like, what is like so the discussion of public events is just like another way to like achieve critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it like the only way to achieve critical thinking?
No, but it's a huge part of it.
Okay, so if we showed you that we increase critical thinking in some other way, like would it just kind
Well,
of
how? I mean,
Huh?
like, how?
Well, that's for like rebuttal. I can give you cards for cards and reading as
Yeah,
well.
sure.
That's it, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Before I start prep, I'd like to see a couple quotes. So the first one is like the minority like questions being like rejected.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And then also, yeah, that was the meta-analysis, right? Oh, also could I see your dropouts?
Oh, yeah, thanks for the line.
Yeah.
The first one would be Roger.
Oh, okay, the dropouts. Are the exams necessarily standardized? Like, what does it say that?
Would you want like different than
Well, like, what's it including in instructor?
yeah, but you just like drop a break.
Okay, so this is like the only.
I really don't.
Thank you.
That's done. I use the 4077. Partner night, opponents, all three judges. We're gonna play, let's start with time. Start on the frame that the opponents present. They say that we have to look to having an equitable system in order to determine whether or not standardized tests are beneficial. While Jack and I can see that having an equitable system is beneficial, they have to link all the harms specifically to standardized testing. This will come into play later on throughout the speech. So against their first contention in which they discuss educational harms, I have several responses. First, they talk about narrowing the curriculum. However, this is a low percentage. Ohio reported that standardized testing only took about 19 hours of prep throughout the whole school year. This is minimal, and the impact really can't be weighed significantly because of the fact that Norman Augustine concludes that this is a positive time trade-off. He states that we need to use these standardized tests to perpetuate reform within the system, which leads to immense benefits. But furthermore, we're going to look to the whole concept about how Kaufman explains how minority students or students in general who have creative thinking aren't jeopardized by standardized testing. He found a correlation between critical thinkers scoring higher on standardized tests, so when they talk about creative thinking, you really drop that. But furthermore, they talk about this whole concept about current events, right? But the argument fundamentally doesn't make sense. There's several responses. First, you realize that standardized testing and discussing current events aren't mutually exclusive. Students can do standardized testing and they can talk about current events. The opponents don't show that there's a significant trade-off. But furthermore, you're going to look at the whole concept about how they talk about dropout rates, right? So I read their card, and their card said that harder tests lead to increased dropout rates. But that's not an indictment or a harm on standardized testing, simply because of the fact that hard standardized tests are in fact essential to lead to positive reform in the system. That's what Jack and I explained with the Don W. Hooper card, in which he states that we need to identify inequities through having difficult tests to see where students are lacking. Realize that if we don't have hard tests to see where the disparities lie, we can't lead to positive reform, we can't benefit the educational system. But furthermore, when they discuss this whole concept about dropouts, I have another response. Lohan concludes that there is no correlation between dropout rates and standardized testing. Dropout rates may happen in spite of standardized testing, but no correlation or evidence shows that one causes the other, so you really can't for further analysis. But furthermore, against their second contention, in which they discuss inequities, there's a lot of big issues, but you could start off by turning their whole second contention by the fact that the only way to solve for inequities within the educational system is through fostering standardized tests. We know that standardized tests are critical in closing the gap, and Sean Kavanaugh in 2008 concludes that the achievement gap has actually been closed, contrary to the opponent's evidence, due to standardized testing, or at least it is narrowed. But furthermore, you look to the Davis M. Denny card for another warrant. What she explains is that superintendents are using this data to narrow in and focus more on English language learners, students with disabilities, minorities, to help them in the educational system in which they have more equity. But furthermore, look at the Nikhil Jha evidence, and he explains how there's an increase in student funding towards minorities and all students in general, so students really are lifted up onto an equitable playing field. Next, they talk about implicit biases and how African American and Latino questions are tossed out. Jack made the analysis in Crossfire. That doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a, quote, African American question, especially because standardized tests are comprehensive. How can a math question be centered towards African Americans? Their analysis really doesn't make sense, and their warrant doesn't follow through with what's actually happening. But furthermore, when they discuss the whole concept about how low-income students are harmed, you're going to turn this in two ways. First, you're going to look to Nikhil Jha, and again, you're going to cross-apply the Brian Jacobs card, in which they explain how these students are actually getting more funding to make an equitable society. Absent standardized testing, we see less funding dished out from these schools because these schools don't realize that they need to send out the funding. So ultimately what we conclude is that every $500 in per pupil spending in the meta-analysis by Nikhil Jha finds, there's an increase in student achievement. So holistically, in terms of scope, we see that a meta-analysis of the entire U.S. school district is an immense benefit because it affects all students. So ultimately, all of their harms are either extra topical, not linked to standardized testing, and it's for all these reasons that I strongly urge a pro ballot. Thank you.
So, judges ready? Fun?
Yep. Parker?
So, off time wrap, I'm just going to start with an observation, then go to their observations in downward pace. Time starts now. The observation, what you need to realize is that you don't need standardized testing to implement anything they're talking about. Teachers can still evaluate their own students through other means like college attendance rates and also their own teacher evaluation that heavily doesn't rely on standardized testing or dropout rates and GPAs. These are the other types of issues that you can implement other than standardized testing. Furthermore, let's look towards your second observation where they talk about quantitative data. Realize that you're actually going to be looking towards qualitative data, right? You can't necessarily measure everything in education. Education is like this type of theory where you have to look towards everything. That's because critical thinking and other types of issues can't be quantified to the extent that they want. You always look towards the negative side. Go to their first contention where they talk about reforms. They go to their first point where they talk about international testing. What they fail to realize, and they misread the resolution, is that it only limits them to U.S. standardized testing. Because of that, don't let them bring up this random piece of evidence. Go to their second subpoint where they talk about domestic testing. A couple of responses to this contention. First, just as how you don't send a puppy to clean after its own mess, you don't have the same exact standardized testing organizations to create new types of standards. Empirically, they don't show you a single reform that's actually going to be implemented. Because of that, you can't grant them a single impact stemming from this contention. But furthermore, Ball tells you that once we receive the data of the different types of standardized tests, Teachers, because of the different types of incentives that they have to increase the test scores, they only look for students who have the ability to pass a standardized test. Because of that, they ignore students of the lower half, place these students into remedial programs and other programs that often are not evaluated by standardized tests. You perpetuate a cycle of inequality that they don't answer to. Go to their second contention where they talk about the achievement gap. They claim that we can't fix what we can't measure, but there's other types of measuring systems. Look towards dropout rates, look towards high school GPAs. Who knows their students the best? The teachers. You can come from their own teacher evaluations. You can drop this entire ideology. But furthermore, they talk about how we're actually going to be decreasing the achievement gap, but what they fail to realize is that when you look towards their own piece of evidence, it comes from 2008. Maybe in 2008 that was occurring, but when we look towards more recent trends of 50 years of analysis, the achievement gap is actually going to be increasing between African Americans and white Americans. That's why you prefer our evidence, because it's more recent, analyzes more time. But furthermore, realize that this funding only goes to good students, right? The NCLB only gives funding to students who have the ability to pass a standardized test, and because of that, students such as minorities who often fail the standardized test are further left behind. When you put funding towards one direction, and you put that one direction above everyone else, you perpetuate a cycle of inequality. Go to their third contention where they talk about increased funding, right? When you look towards a specific piece of evidence where they talk about $600 to every single student, that's blasphemy. The money only goes to It only goes to specific sets of students who have the ability to pass the standardized test. Because of that, don't let them trick you into buying this entire ideology. The truth of the matter is, funding only goes to specific students who pass the test, and because of that, you perpetuate a cycle of inequality even more. But realize that, go to their fourth contention where they talk about efficacy. When you look towards a specific contention, they warrant it with this increase of accountability. But in order to measure their accountability, they use standardized testing methods, right? But realize that the data that comes from this are often skewed. There's 3 warrants why this is true. First, like KPJC organizations tell you specifically that teachers often resort to cheating to boost student motivation and boost the student test scores. Because of that, we honestly don't know how much students actually know because of the cheating problems. But furthermore, standardized testing often tests students on obscure information, like this information who actually has no effect on their real life. Because of that, it doesn't necessarily measure how much a student actually knows. The third warrant is that it tests it doesn't look towards areas such as PE, science, and other issues that are just as important in a student's growth. And because of that, you can drop your warrant right there. Here's the last study where they talk about Phelps, and where they talk about 91% of studies actually benefit standardized testing. But what they fail to realize is that Phelps self-indicts him in the middle of the study. He only looked for specific data sets, and he tells you specifically that when he conducted the meta-analysis study, he took out a bunch of studies that he felt wasn't necessarily true to his specific ideology. But furthermore, realize that more than 50% of the data that he uses comes from areas such as higher education and areas such as other countries. Because of that, what you need to realize is that since the resolution binds them to K-12 education in the United States, don't let them grant them that impact. Thank you. Oh, yes. Ready?
Sorry, can I take the first question?
Go ahead.
Alright, so let's discuss this whole concept about how you say there's alternatives to standardized testing. Why does that warrant a con value?
Okay, so first of all, the resolution doesn't necessarily have to bind us into proving an alternative, right?
Of course, that's my
The
point.
resolution is just basically saying that in a world with standardized testing, we see that these harms are going to outweigh the
Sure.
benefits that come from standardized
So
testing,
my question is why do you present alternatives? Why do you say that there's other ways to measure
Because
when
you make
that's
the
not
argument.
required by the resolution?
Because you yourself, I'm quoting you now, right? You claim that the only way to actually solve for a problem is actually going to be
Okay.
using test data and other types of data
So-
methods, right?
so
I'm
would-
telling you that there's different types of data methods that teachers
So
can use,
would you make
making your
the-
argument non-unique.
So would you make the concession that having an alternative way of measuring student performance isn't necessarily a harm on standardized testing?
Okay, so first of all, what I just need
Is there a trade-off?
Okay, so first of all, what I'm trying to stress in today's round is that when we emphasize so much on standardized testing, because of the laws passed by the No Child Left Behind grant, what we see in the status quo is that teachers place such an emphasis on standardized testing that they often teach the test. So there's probably a trade-off that I would like to see.
Just really quickly though, right? We say that teaching to the test in fact is beneficial because it's the only objective way to know where disparities are occurring in society, right? We say,
Okay, hold on.
at least it's the best way, right?
No, hold on. First, I would argue that it's not the best way, and that by using standardized testing, we could be potentially trading off with a better alternative. But more
No,
importantly,
yeah, that's
who
the
knows their
point.
students the best, right?
Yeah,
I would
but-
argue that teachers know their students the
Right,
best.
you say they could potentially trade off with other alternatives, right? But you make that assumption, you don't say that the trade-off occurs. But the
Okay,
point at which
so-
we say standardized
hold on.
testing doesn't take that much of instructional time.
Hold on.
How could you make this?
So first of all, that evidence comes from only Ohio, where we give you a national study where 35% of instructional time is being cut, right?
I can
But
give you
second
another
and more importantly, right? I'm not a messiah. I can't predict the future. I can't predict an alternative world. When we look towards standardized testing, we only have to evaluate the harms of that, and because the harms outweighs the benefits.
I would say yes, like, that's exactly my point. Like, I don't know why you tell me to do this. I'm saying the only thing that's unnecessarily relevant to the rest of it.
Now, you just blatantly make the statement that we can only solve these problems through standardized testing. I'm just saying there's other methods that we can use. I don't necessarily have to prove that they actually will work. I'm just saying that they have the potential to potentially work. Sure. You mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So when you come up here in your last meeting and you talk about how we have to use identification methods to actually solve for this inequality, right? Sure. Where has this actually happened? Where has reforms happened?
Okay, like Davis and Denny, right? Like, that part is very specific in explaining, like, how these standardized tests highlighted gaps in student performance.
Okay,
It allowed
so
them to
where does
focus
he
in-
take this data from? Oh, yeah.
Alright, like, so they narrowed in on, like, these, like, disproportionately, like, worse off students, and it actually, like, led to approaching the achievement gap.
Okay, so for all we know, that could be in one school with a few students, right? You don't show me the magnitude of where the reforms are actually happening. How do we outweigh the statistics that are
I would
showing you on the
contend, like,
national
we need to do,
level?
like, meta-analysis, and, like, the impacts are consistent across the nation. Like, for instance, Sean Kavanaugh on the closing of the achievement gap, like, that is a nationwide statistic, that is not
Okay, so
limited to
first
one
of all,
school.
that analyzes 1 year of 2008, whereas we give you 50
Well, I
years
mean,
of
it says,
analysis.
no, but it says, like, since, like, nationwide.
No, I don't think you understand our analysis, right? We're saying that whenever you
When they bring up alternatives in the next week, they're gonna come up here and say that standardized testing isn't the only way to measure student success. Remember, this isn't relevant in the round. If we could show you even there is a slight benefit to standardized testing that outweigh the harms, we win the round. With this in mind, look to the first arguments and why you want to pick up the pro. This is my analysis. We can show you numerous evidence. For instance, Davis and Denny of the University of Texas quantifies that when we actually use these standardized tests, what it does is it actually shows teachers where to focus in and narrow in to benefit the student curriculum. Furthermore, they say that the Sean Kavanaugh card isn't recent enough for closing the achievement gaps, but when we look to the Vox card, they call drop from 2015, says that standardized tests are essential to closing achievement gaps, extend that across the globe, and we're winning on minorities. Literally, the only response that they make is that low-income students and these students of color are actually harmed on the standardized tests. But remember the analysis we make. First, there's no such thing as a quote African American question or a Latino question. And secondarily, we make the argument that low-income students is backsolved by the fact that an increase in funding towards these students makes it a more equitable society. And secondarily, standardized testing isn't the actor that perpetrates the harms that they talk about. Next is going to be school funding, right? We already need two pieces of evidence. First is from the University of Melbourne, and they quantify that a 0.15 increase in student achievement of a standard deviation is associated with $500 given to each student. And then the Brian Jacobs part said that $600 increase per student since the passage of No Child Left Behind. This mitigates a majority of their offense because we see minorities are actually benefited more. But fourth, on accountability, they really didn't make a lot of responses. All they say that there is a negative time trade-off. But they ignore the Norman Augustine card, which says that standardized tests are the only way to actually create positive reform in society. And we show you that because of the increase in accountability that teachers have, this leads to numerous benefits in the educational system and is ultimately the only way to reform. Furthermore, we're going to look to the whole concept about the international standardized test and domestic test. Because this is the only way to perpetrate reform, or the best way, I strongly urge a pro ballot. Thank you.
Remaining minute and 15.
the first thing you need to realize is that it's not the negation's burden to prove a world without standardized testing. We just have to show you that standardized testing is on net harming students, and if we do that, you automatically sign your ballot for the negation. With that said, go to the first reason why you can vote for our side, which is going to be inequality. They make a couple responses. One, they talk about reforms, but make them show you their evidence. They only give you one citation of a reform coming from Ohio, whereas we tell you that across the nation, education inequality is actually happening. Two, they talk about how we can decrease this inequality with increased funding. But remember that the NCLB Act actually only gives money to students who pass the standardized test. Since minority students are the ones that are failing these tests, you further perpetuate a cycle of inequality because you're only giving money to the top. You make this inequality worse, and that's why we give you Hirsch that tells you that schools often neglect social economic barriers, and because of that, you perpetuate inequality. But second and more importantly, Brooks tells you that the achievement gap after 50 years has increased, right? They can give you one statistics coming from 2008 with one author that gives you no quantification whatsoever. But when you look towards quantifications and you look towards an on-net study where of 50 years, we see that the achievement gap between African Americans and white Americans have increased by 100%. That's a clear reason why you vote for our side, because we infinitely prolong the time frame of this issue. Go to the second issue in today's round, which is on educational harms. Their response to this is that it's not mutually exclusive. But at the point at which I tell you that standardized testing is directly responsible for cutting 35% of instructional time without other issues, and that 80% of teachers cite standardized testing as the sole reason why they're cutting from current events, you can drop this response. When you look towards this issue, remember that when we're cutting away from these classes, we decrease the critical thinking of these students. When these students don't have critical thinking, since it's a prerequisite for every single thing that they talk about, these students are going to be failing in society. That's why we show you that on scope, we win in today's round, because we impacted every single student, because of all our studies are on the national scale, but more importantly, on probability. They can't guarantee that reforms are actually going to happen, whereas we can guarantee you that when you vote for the negation, like these harms are still going to be perpetuated. Thank you.